Welcome back to the Sustainable Creator Podcast. Yep, this is not Joe. She usually does the intros, but she's not here. And this is going to be an interesting episode because this is the beginning of an experiment that we're trying. We just hit 20 episodes and we are now experimenting with what it would look like to have a second weekly episode where you'll hear from me or Joe or both of us. And so in this episode, I kind of want to walk through what is the strategy behind why we are experimenting this. Why is it going to be different? What is it going to look like? What brought us to this point? And kind of just show you behind the scenes, what is the process that got us to asking the question, is it worth committing time each week to have a second episode? And so before we get too far into this, what does this look like? This is a Thursday that this episode is going live. Most of our episodes go live on Tuesday. Most of our episodes are interviews where we talk to experts about what is important for creative service providers. And so this is going to be a shorter episode. We're targeting these Thursday episodes to be somewhere between 5 and 25 minutes. And we're taking a fairly laid back voice notes approach to this. Instead of them being super polished, we probably will do one takes on these. Instead of hearing for both of us or banters, we're going to take a topic, a framework, a concept, something that we are seeing in strategy recently that we can break down that we think will help you be a more sustainable creative service provider. And so the strategy that got us here. Up until this point, when we launched our podcast 20 episodes ago, or back in February, I think, there was on the premise of our dream clients listen to podcasts, which is fairly universally true. When we talk to either one-on-one clients or our break room clients, they are asking questions of like, do you have a good podcast for this? Or when we recommend one, they ask, do you have a link for this? And so it's a medium that we see used a lot. One of the things that we've been seeing over the last 6 to 12 months is trust is getting a lot harder to build on social media. And so how do we build the authority and the expertise for ourselves with prospective clients? And podcast is a version of that is working. We have gotten people schedule discovery calls from listening to the podcast, whereas directly through Instagram is less common for us. And 2 weeks ago, if you listen to our podcast 2 weeks ago, we did a recap of going to Craft and Commerce. And if you listen to that one, I was talking about podcasts a lot coming out of Craft and Commerce because it started more conversations than almost any other part of our business, just having a podcast. And that was a little bit surprising to me, but also not, because we had already started experiencing of the people that we got to talk to on podcasts opened a lot of doors, or at least put our names inside of rooms that we weren't expecting. And so on the interview front, it has delivered on all of the original premises that we started this podcast on. But in the past couple of weeks, I've been starting to think about the one part is building trust with our prospective clients, or showing people how we think as coaches and what are our go-to frameworks, or how we think about solving a problem. If all of our airtime is asking other people questions, it's less teaching people how do we think about things. And this was really brought into focus for me when we were at Craft and Commerce, because one of the people we sat down and had lunch with runs a very healthy business. Podcast is a big part of that. And her comment was, you should be doing more solo episodes if you want to be driving clients from this. And at this point, we're not building a media company that's paid for by sponsors that wants a ton of listeners on a podcast. We are building a business that is service or community based, and we are marketing our own services. And a lot of that is, do people like us as coaches or as community leaders? And the knowledge that we are putting out into the world is really important for that sales process. Arguably, potentially more important than an interview where it's someone else's thought process that we're giving airtime to. But at the same time, if I think about the conversations that we've had with a lot of people, those interviews are really valuable. And so I don't necessarily want to give those up. And that is why we are entering this phase of experimenting with a second weekly podcast that's more of a voice note of our thoughts to you, a little bit less prepared. And I thought it would be an interesting exercise to go back to, now that we're 20 episodes in, what has the strategy shifts in our podcast been since we launched? because I currently view ourselves, yes, we're 20 episodes in, but I think we're on phase 3 already. And as I looked back across the episodes that we put up, I think the first phase of our podcast was topical. Examples of this was we talked about Pinterest with Coley. We talked about starting a podcast with Alyssa. We talked about service-based memberships with Becky. This was more of how do we think about a topic? And one of like the keystone questions in that interview format was, in the first 100 days of trying this thing, what are the milestones you should focus on? How should you be measuring your success? And what are the actions you should be taking? And that was really interesting interviews. But then we shifted into a second phase where we started interviewing people about one thing that they did. And so how do we learn the story of that thing that they have done? And examples of this could be, we interviewed Sam Vanderwielen around the 1-year anniversary of her book launch on what does it take to publish a book? Or we talked to Chanel about her 30-day email sequence as she was gearing up to do it a second time. Or we interviewed Kalia about emceeing on stage at the 1 billion follower summit and what it took to get to that stage. And those stories were really interesting. But if I go back to the original reason we started this, was helping creative service providers build sustainable businesses, those were not having as big of an impact as talking about granular things. And so phase 3 that we really entered into was the how-to phase, is what I've called it. And that's kind of where we've settled on my favorite type of episodes right now. And the interviews that we're doing is examples of this is how to partner with local businesses, an interview we did with Belle Grubb, or how do you find hidden buyers in your IG story, Instagram stories with Alyssa, or how do you run a good sales call, most recently with Leslie. And this was the idea of how do we take something that we are hearing a question asked by creative service providers and go deep on that one thing by finding an expert that can give context on how to do that thing better. And that has started the most conversations for us. Hasn't necessarily done better on listens than any of our other episodes, but when I think about the conversations that we're having and the impact that we see from people that actually listen to the episodes, it just feels different. And that is the direction that I want us to keep going, in that how-to phase. And that is what kind of guides when I think about how we're going to do these second weekly episodes that we're experimenting with for the next 4 weeks, is how do we take something and break it down into a how-to that's from Joe or my brain. And that's this strategy walkthrough that we're doing, why we are doing this. What is the process that we're thinking about to make this decision better? And when we think about, based on this evolution that we've gone through with our podcast in a few short months, and we think about the future of what the podcast will be, what do we want it to actually do for us in our business? We do want it to position ourselves as expert. We want to create long form that we can then create clips out of or segment into carousels, things like that. And so if we create once long form, it's a lot easier to chunk that down into smaller pieces. We want to think about how do we can have an impact on a bigger level, because personally, I'm starting to feel as we shift away from the social algorithm on social platforms to more of an entertainment algorithm, it feels like less is getting applied from social media than ever before. And if we are educators that want to help people build businesses, how do we show up in the places that people are actually learning and applying things from? And it just feels like that's more of podcasts right now than necessarily some of the other places that we have been spending time creating. Building trust is one we've talked about. And eventually, as this grows, I would love this to be an income stream of its own. And so there is some things that I'm questioning, like as we build, what does it look like to build a dedicated audience that if we find the right sponsors for, it's really valuable. And that's part of why we're staying fairly specific on creative service providers, because A, we can really help them, but to the right people, that's also a very good place to put sponsor dollars. And yes, I have already started asking some of those questions to platforms. And when I think about, like, we've gone through these phases, we started paying attention to, like, what is the feedback or what are the things that we're hearing from people as we are entering into this experiment. And I already mentioned that we had booked a discovery call based on something that we had said in a interview, and the fact that it was mentioned of like, I was listening to this interview you had with this person and I thought this comment was interesting, and now I'm interested in coaching with you. And so how do we make space for more of our thoughts to live on our podcast feed? The second one is, when we think about the 20 episodes that we've streamed, we've done one solo episode so far. That's the Craft and Commerce recap that we did. That was the one that actually got us the most like DM or social engagement for us, that started conversations with people we genuinely wanted to connect with. And it was based on the fact of, they sent a message, I like how you talked about this thing, or thanks for this episode, it was really good. And because it was us, they were appreciating us, not necessarily like reaching out to the person that was interviewed on the podcast. And so that is still bringing us back a little bit more front and center, which is also a little bit scary. And then the last one is inside of the break room. At the end of every month, we do a private podcast that sits on the feed where Joe and I break down the past month. What were the things we tried? What were the experiments we did? What did our analytics look like? What are we learning? What are we going to experiment on the next month? And those are some of the highest engagement things that I will see inside of the break room in our Circle platform, because people appreciate that they're seeing the behind the scenes of how we think about what we are learning and how we are trying things. And based on all of those, that was the question of, what if we experiment putting some of that knowledge out into our podcast feed as a way to show people how we think about solving problems and how we're building our own businesses and the frameworks that we're currently discussing with other people. And so what does this look like moving forward? Tuesdays are going to stay interviews for the most part. They're something that I care deeply about. I also genuinely just enjoy connecting with people on the podcast every week. And we just got off of an interview, the one going up next week, and I'm actually really excited. I learned things, and every week there's like a little bit that I'm learning. I get to have a cool conversation. We are expanding our network, but also it's something that I can then help someone else show our audience how to do something new. And as much as I like being a coach, I'm also an educator, and being able to share knowledge is something that's really cool. And I care a lot about those interviews being really good. And I'm excited about all the ones that we are thinking about in July, and we're scheduling into August at this point. And I think there's a really cool like running list of people that we can interview now, just from personal connections that we're making. Thursdays, I kind of said this up at the top, this is an experimental format. I am right now only saying that we're trying to commit to 3 to 4 weeks of this so that we can start seeing what this looks like. That should give us enough chance for, I can do a solo episode. Joe will also do a solo episode sometime this month on what she learned from her Leveling Up My Life series and the things that you can apply from that. We're probably going to try and do at least one that is both of us, so that we get enough data to see what does it look like for each of us individually to have solo episodes and another joint episode. And that's really around like, how do we think about processes, concepts, framework breakdowns? When we try experiments, like building in public, this is a great way to go a little bit longer form, but it's going to be pretty casual. Like, as you see, this is not going to be a 45-minute episode. We're going to come in under 20 minutes on this. And this is just a voice note from me to you as I'm thinking about thoughts and what I think would be helpful for you to learn if you were going through something similar as this. I genuinely am curious how you guys think about this. And if you like this format, if you don't like this format, send us a DM on Instagram at Joe and Lyndon and let us know your thoughts. Like, what are the things that you would love to see us talk about in solo episodes? Are there things that you just genuinely miss Joe and you want her to be in all the episodes and you don't like seeing just me on the podcast? Or is there specific formats that you think we should be experimenting? Because I'm genuinely enjoying the podcast right now and I'm open to experimenting new things. And I would just love to hear what your guys' thoughts are on this. And I think that kind of wraps us up. Like, we're just around 15 minutes here, and come back on Tuesday for a great interview with Steve that I'm so excited for you guys to listen to. See you guys next week.